Bonjour et bienvenue. I am Marie-Monique Stackel, and I'm the president of the French Institute Alliance Française. And you're in for a wonderful, wonderful and privileged moment with Marie-Louise Pierson and Tom Knapp. We are so delighted that they came. We had this discussion a few months ago, and it seemed so in the future, but here we are. We've been sold out, so there's, I'm sure, people who are very, very sad that they couldn't make it. And I want to say that there is this wonderful book that Marie-Louise quit the Rockefeller family home that she will sign. It's a book signing as well after their talk. The talk will be moderated by Tom Knapp, and he's an art consultant and appraiser. And all the pictures that you will see, which are going to show you the amazing, amazing collection of the Rockefeller, have been taken by Marie-Louise Pierson. And there was a great, great exhibit at Eric Mourlot's gallery, and that's when I fell in love with this great collection and her pictures particularly. So you will have some quiche. I know that you will be well fed because I already ate some of the hors d'oeuvre, and I thought, my God, are we going to have more? But anyway, the quiche has been donated and everything by a wonderful young man who is an entrepreneur, came to New York 3 years ago. His name is Benjamin Sormonte, and everything you will eat, it's called Maman Bakery, and everything you will eat has been particularly made by him, and his mother and father are in our kitchen. So I think it's a family affair. Not.
Thank you. Bon appétit. Thank you.
Not only that, but he's very good looking, as you can see. And so I just want you to enjoy the quiche, the salad, and everything. And I want to thank and drink a lot of wine, which are given also to us by Vina Deis. Thank you very, very much. And here they come, our two conférenciers. Merci.
Bill, can you hear me? Okay. First of all, I want to thank Marie-Monique and the kindness she has shown Marie-Louise and I for allowing us to be here. And we promise we will not speak French. You do not want to hear us speak French, I assure you. I'm very honored I've known Marie-Louise and her beautiful, gorgeous mother, who's sitting right next to Eric Mourlot, Ann Roberts, for several years now. And one of the great treats for me is they have shared not only their home, but their love and passion for art with me. And I can tell you it's infectious. And when you get to know Marie-Louise and her mother, you understand that I've decided last night that art can be in your DNA. And also, one of the greatest gifts, and it's very Socratic, an artist creates art, but it's not finished until it's appreciated. So the conclusion of the art process is when it's loved and collected. And there is no family, and I'm not being patronizing, in this hemisphere, and not in another one since the de Medicis, who have collected and loved art as much as the Rockefeller family. And the United States is so blessed, and we, particularly in New York, is to have them. And it's an ongoing process, because Marie-Louise, as a child, and we would go up to Kaikut, would show me where she would hide with her brothers and sister. And then I had some lovely opportunities to be with her great David Rockefeller, and he would show me where he would hide. And it was so great because her great uncle David was at the opening of the Museum of Modern Art, and he just passed away a few months ago.
The last living.
He was the last living person to go to the opening.
To go to the opening,
And
or to be there at the opening.
And I asked him once, I said, "What did you have in your room as a child?" And you know what he said to me? "Cubist Picasso, of course." Oh, yes, and I had a nice Matisse, too. So I said, so much for Mother Goose. Right. So without further ado, I'd just like Mary Louise to tell us something about her experience as an artist, but also as an appreciator and a conduit of her family's art. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much to Tom Knapp and also to Marie Monique for making this happen. I'm thrilled to be here today. Well, I can say that having the privilege of being the fifth generation to grow up in this family that loved the arts, starting with the classics and working all the way to modernism and impressionism and on, is a real privilege, because they were just like the trees in your backyard. They were just part of my places to run around and play. So we would play with Henry Moores and Lachaise and all these other things, and we'll show you pictures of all of this. And it definitely made an impression for me, and I ended up going to Rhode Island School of Design and becoming an artist and painting and illustrating, and then of course doing photography. So then my grandfather passed away in 1979, and all of a sudden this wonderful playground that we all were able to run around was going to go to the National Trust. And we were told that we couldn't really go up there anymore, that it was now owned by the National Trust, and this was all legal things or whatever. Anyway, so I sort of panicked and thought, well, I have to capture this place that I was able to run around. So that's what I did. And I ran around and started photographing, and the family decided we should do a book for the family, and then it turned into let's get it published. And so that's the product here. And then I approached my mother to write the text, and she did an amazing, amazing job with the text. So it's a wonderful book of photographs, but also of a wonderful story of how it was built and how the family came to this area.
Didn't you hang out of a plane?
I did. For this photograph, I was in a helicopter, and you can't really see in this light, but you can see the propeller is right here, the shadow of it. Anyway, so they took the door off the helicopter because if you're photographing, this was just a passenger helicopter. It wasn't a army thing or anything, so they had to take the door off. And they taped my seatbelt with duct tape because it was just a release seatbelt. And he said, "This is totally illegal, but I think I should do this." I was like, I think that's a great idea. Anyway, so it was a very windy day, so they could stay stationary, and I could literally ask them to move a little to the left, a little to the right, maybe a little higher, until we got it just at the right spot so I could get that photograph.
There's another helicopter story in your family.
That's right, there is, but we have to wait for that one. Anyway, so this wonderful place was, I'll just say very quickly that my great-great-grandfather, John D. Rockefeller, and his wife, Laura, came to New York from Cleveland in 1858. And they bought this huge townhouse in 4 West 54th Street, which is now where MoMA sits. And which is, people don't realize that's actually where they lived. And so they bought that townhouse, and they started to live in New York City, mostly in the winter. And then John D. Sr., also known as Senior, his brother came to him and said, "I've bought this amazing piece of property along the Hudson River in 1885, and you must come and see this. You must come get some property here." So then Senior did, and he ended up buying a very large piece of property, which you can see is up on a hill. And this is where the Tappan Indians used to use this hill for signals and for looking out. Then the Dutch came and wiped out the Indians in that area, and they named this hill Kaikit, or Kaikout, which means look out or look about or something like that. Anyway, so it's sort of like I quit or kai kit is how you're supposed to say it. And he bought this property in 1893, and not until 1913 was this house finished. So for a long time they were looking at the lay of the land, and there was about 3,000 acres that they bought. So they moved into this wonderful house, and then John D. Jr. and Abby Aldridge met, and they met each other in 1893, which was right when that property was purchased. And they fell in love, of course, and they got married, actually a couple of years after that. They were married in 1901. And they both were very influenced by their fathers, who were both collectors as well. John D. Sr. not so much, but he loved the classical art. And so John D. Sr., one of his favorite things was this sculpture, and Tom can tell us a little bit about it, but this sculpture was considered to be a Greek statue of,
The British Museum said it was Greek.
Nefertiti, I think it is.
And Lord Devine, who was the biggest salesman in the world, agreed with him and told Mr. Rockefeller if he bought this, he would be the hit of the other side of the Atlantic. There are other art historians from these very bizarre schools, like Harvard and Columbia, that said it wasn't. It's agreed upon now that it's Roman. What does that mean? About a tenth of the price.
Well, and so, right.
That he paid.
But back then was a big deal because he paid a lot of money, which was probably, I don't know what, $3,000 or something. No, I'm sure it was more than that, but still, it was not. It was, and all these articles came out, and oh, he's been had. It's actually Roman. It's not Greek. And my great-great-grandfather was like, I love this piece, it's wonderful, and I'm not concerned. So, and so it resides there still at the estate. And these sort of things were certainly an influence for John D. Jr., his son. And Jr. ended up collecting a lot of Asian porcelains and things of that sort. And this is Chinese Kang porcelains, very, very early, from the 17th century. No, really early.
He also collected medieval art, which is the cloisters.
Oh, right.
That was
That's
his
a great
gift.
Yeah.
So this gentleman called modern art his wife's outlandish.
Oh, yes, well, we're getting to that
But
now.
this man liked Asian art and medieval.
So then, of course, Abby was also influenced by her father, who would take her to Europe. Her father was the senator of Providence.
Senator Aldridge.
Senator Aldridge. And he would take her to Europe, and they would go around collecting mostly classical pieces, but that obviously had an influence on her. And she had such an interest in this that, as her husband called her outlandish hobby, when it spilled out from the bedrooms of the children and other places, he finally said, okay, you can have what used to be the playroom, you can have the whole top floor of the townhouse.
Which was then the largest
And
townhouse
then
in
I
New
don't,
York.
That's right, and then I don't have to see it. It'll be all on the top floor, because he didn't like seeing it, because he let her have it in the children's rooms, but then it started spilling out of the children's rooms because she kept collecting. So, so anyway, so this was where her outlandish collection ended up. And in the meantime, the two of them were also traveling themselves. They were big travelers, and they went to France, and Junior fell in love with France. They both did.
The whole family loves France.
Yes. And so this was something that they did together. Well, actually, Junior was really mostly interested in this.
Is this a Rockefeller house?
So, of course, this is Fontainebleau. And Versailles was the other one that he was very interested in, and other buildings as well. But he really, one of his absolute loves was restoring Versailles, and he basically rebuilt the entire roof system so that it still exists to this day, which is amazing. I had no understanding of how much he put into this. And at the same time, he was building Williamsburg in Virginia. But he was still going back to France and working on Versailles. So this photograph is Fontainebleau, but it's taken by my grandfather, Nelson, with his little brownie or something. He was running around taking photographs because he was on many of these trips. All right, now here is Abby Aldridge in her office. So on many of their trips, there was one trip where they were on a ship and they were heading for Egypt, and Abby meets this wonderful woman, Lily Bliss, and they start talking about the arts, and they start talking about their collections and so on, and they decide, well, we must have a museum for our outlandish collections.
And they had all been to the Armory show in 1913.
That
was the impetus.
That's right. And so they thought, we need a place for our art, this outlandish, what people consider outlandish. So on her way back from Egypt, she ran into another woman, Cornelia Sullivan, also known as Mary Quinn. And Mary Quinn actually knew Lily Bliss, and they all decided, we must start a museum. And we're going to call it the Museum of Modern Art. So it first opened in 1929, and it was in a building on the 12th floor in the Heckscher building, which was 730 Fifth Avenue. And that's where it was in its very sort of fledgling state. And then from there, it went they rented a building that belonged to John D. Sr., and that was like a brownstone, and they moved it there, and that was 11 West 53rd. So they were getting closer to the final spot. And then finally, it moved to, in 1939, they moved it to where MoMA now actually sits, which is where 10 West 54th Street, which was one of the buildings they lived in. They actually tore down that huge townhouse and some other ones, and then they built the first Museum of Modern Art, the official first museum.
Wasn't Philip Johnson involved in this?
I don't know. Well, you might know that. Yeah, that I can't remember. He probably was, because he did a lot with Nelson. And Nelson was just graduating from college at this time. Here's Nelson. Nelson is my grandfather, as you probably know. And this is him at Dartmouth College. And he was just graduating. He graduated in 1930, so it was right during this transition of the museum. And so he actually, because he loved the arts so much with his mother, or he was really learning about the arts from his mother, and I'll talk about that, he helped with the transfer of that. So there is the young man, and he met my grandmother the same year, and they got married that year. So Nelson, of course, adored his mother, and imagine your mother starting this museum and putting this building up on Fifth Avenue. You know, that's amazing. And so he really looked up to her, and this is a wonderful photograph of him literally looking up to his mother. And she decided to take him, and she took all her children, but she really sparked something with Nelson. She took him to galleries and things of that sort, and to art openings. And so he wrote her a letter one time, and he said, "You don't know how much I enjoyed our trips to Mr. Davies and the visit to the downtown galleries. I feel as if I had been introduced to a new world of beauty. And for the first time, I think I have really been able to appreciate and understand pictures, even though only a little bit." So then she wrote him back, "If you start to cultivate your taste and eye so young, you ought to be very good at it by the time you can afford to collect. Art is one of the great resources of my life. I believe that it not only enriches the spiritual life, but it makes one more sane and sympathetic, more observant and understanding, regardless of whatever age it springs from, whatever subject it represents." It's a wonderful thing to say, to write to her son. And I think that made a huge impression on him. So Nelson also admired a lot of the work that she collected as well as his father.
This is so rare.
And this is an amazing piece, so you should give a little history on this if you would like.
There's nothing like this in the world. And when it was first exhibited in London,
That's right.
Lord Devine wanted the British Museum to buy it. But Mr. Rockefeller had more funds than the British Museum. And this is so rare because it's when Tang becomes circular. And
That's
it's,
right.
it's the
Yeah.
idea of when Chinese art, it's one of those precursor pieces when everything goes after it. And this shows the fluidity and how much Asian art changed. And my favorite story is little 7-year-old Nelson said to his mom, "Will you leave this to me in your will?"
Oh yeah, so I have the quote right here of my, it's really great. And he did, he said he was around 8 or 7 or whatever, and he absolutely loved it. And he says, so having been fortunate in my forward thinking, I asked my mother if she would leave it to me in her will. And she did. This was at the age of 7 or 8, and so she did. So there it is, probably of the Tang period of China, which of course it is. But anyway, it's a wonderful, I love that. And she did leave it to him. And it also was in the Metropolitan
He had
for a
this
while.
window put in. This is not the original design.
No, I think this window was in.
Oh, was it?
But it was, because this window actually lifts up. It actually has weights. And it was, John D. Sr. actually had, things like central vacuuming in his house, if you can imagine, in 1913. That wasn't heard of. So that window was engineered so that it would lift up and completely disappear, and then you were open to the patio. And so it was my grandfather's brilliant idea to put this image here, so when you go to that house, and if you go to the front door, it's the first thing you see, because it's on a straight axis from the east to the west. And then that looks right out onto the Hudson River. It's just amazing. And so there it is in perpetuity, which is wonderful. Instead of being sort of in a museum somewhere where you can't really get close to it or whatever.
I'm glad it didn't go to his brother's museum, Asia Society.
That's right. So Nelson, of course, got very involved in MoMA. And he was a trustee first in 1931, and this is just out of school, out of college. So he was in his early 30s. Or no, he was a little younger than that. But he became the second president of MoMA, and that was in 1939. And he really made a huge influence on the arts of the 20th century because of it. A lot of the pieces that he collected became, those artists literally became famous when he actually gave them that attention. Then everyone else started looking, and other museums started collecting.
Well, he was interested in going to the studios, and he befriended so many. He helped, for example, Lachaise, so many people. Calder, he was tremendous friends. So
That's
he
right.
developed relationship. Picasso,
Yeah.
we know from the letters.
That's right, and we'll show pictures of those. And yeah, exactly. He had a relationship with a lot of them. He was the president again in 1946, and then during that presidency, his mother passed away in 1948, which I'm sure was hard for him because they had such a wonderful connection with the museum and the arts. Now, also when he first became president, the first time of Museum Modern Art, he was also helping his father with Rockefeller Center and with the building of the center, and he was helping him choose the art. Now, he talked his father into letting him choose the art, and he said, I really know, of course, and as you may understand, and Tom can tell you some wonderful stories about how his father felt about the modern art and the Impressionist art. He really was not enthusiastic. There's a wonderful story of David telling you, Uncle David.
Mr. Henri Matisse came to the United States and was in Philadelphia seeing Dr. Barnes and was doing some decorative work and paintings for Dr. Barnes. He came to New York and was commissioned to do work for the Rockefeller home in Manhattan. And there was a dinner given by Nelson's father. And of course, Matisse and his translator sat next to Mr. Rockefeller, and Mr. Rockefeller said, "I don't like your paintings, Mr. Matisse." And Mr. Matisse, with a great smile, says, "That's all right, Mrs. Rockefeller does."
I love that. So somehow Nelson convinces his father to let him choose the art for this amazing monumental buildings that are going up right in the center of New York City. So of course, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo with some of their, this looks like a bunch of gangster artists there. Very avant-garde, very cool.
Very edgy.
Very edgy, that's right. They know what's going on.
You wouldn't ask them to dinner.
You wouldn't ask them for directions either.
No.
Anyway, so there they are, and so he first approached Picasso and then Matisse. He couldn't get a hold of Picasso. This was early on, so he didn't really know Picasso at this time. His mother was friends with Matisse, of course, and Matisse was quite elderly, and he said, no, I'm not getting up on scaffolding and painting some giant thing in Rockefeller Center. So then Diego was his next choice. So Diego was like, of course, I would love to do this. Now, there's this wonderful story about this, which some of you may or may not have heard, and I can read little bits of. My grandfather actually wrote down, one of the things he wrote just before he died was about this story, because there were lots of versions of it that were not really accurate, but he actually thought, I should write this down. And he actually, I think he died maybe 3 or 4 years after he wrote this, and it's just a wonderful telling. So if we have time, I'll read some of that. Diego was in his own way as brilliant and versatile as Picasso. He was a good friend of both my mother and myself, but at the time he was very much under the influence of his new and very attractive wife, Frida, who was not only an excellent painter herself, but a politically active Marxist. His mural was to be a portrayal of contemporary American life. The sketches were approved, and he set to work on the site. We were all very enthusiastic. He did a great deal of preparatory research. He went to medical laboratories. This could have been a sign, I think, of maybe some trepidation. The sketches were translated into actual mural paintings. I began to get worried. The central figure turned out to be Lenin, not Lincoln. The woman in the typical, where did I go? The woman in the typical American family scene turned out to have syphilitic ulcers. Yikes. And when I found that one of the more complicated areas of the mural was an illustrated atomical lecture in the art of birth control, and we were just across the avenue from St. Patrick's Cathedral, I arranged to have a quiet talk with Diego at his apartment. It was a perfectly friendly conversation during which I explained to him that Rockefeller Center was a commercial venture and that its success depended on renting space to enumerate individual corporations, and that our objective was beauty for the buildings and enjoyment for the tenants. But that we could not afford to offend their sensibilities or try to propagandize them politically, which of course, hello, Frida. He said he understood our problem and promised to change the parts of the painting that presented a problem. All the time we were talking, Frida was sitting in the adjoining room next to the door that was ajar. As I got up to leave, she came to say goodbye. By the look of determination on her face, I felt intuitively that I had wasted my evening. Now, at this point, Diego quickly finishes the painting in the next week, and of course doesn't change anything. There's Lenin, there's syphilis things going on and all sorts of stuff. And so my grandfather realized that once he finished the painting, then it legally belonged to Rockefeller Center if he paid him. So he paid him, he waited for it to be finished, and then he covered it up. And I would not like to be in the room when he had to tell his father what happened, because his father was very angry and very unhappy about this and pretty much took the reins away from Nelson.
See, look at the next slide.
Oh, yes. Oh, so right. So now, so then that, so it gets destroyed. It sat covered for 9 months, and because it was a fresco and not on a canvas, it could not be pulled off. It literally had to be destroyed. And they did not allow anyone in there with cameras. But Diego did sneak some of his friends in with little cameras, so they did get some photos. But this, so then he repainted it in Mexico. So this is the painting in Mexico that he did. That is pretty much the same painting.
There's John D.
And
John D.
and so you can see on the right is Lenin, right underneath the sort of propeller there, and then tucked
Underneath
in,
syphilis is John D. Rockefeller.
right, there's a syphilis petri dish sort of thing that he painted, and then he put John D. Jr.'s face. You can just barely see it way up there. I'm sorry, I don't have a pointer, but he's holding a glass, a cocktail, which of course he was a devout Baptist. He never drank. And he's with all these women, which of course he was a very faithful husband and would never have, and this was his way of sort of giving him a slap in the face, I would say, for not letting that painting stay. He got a lot of publicity, though, which I think, as Tom
We now know
say, yeah.
the entire thing was contrived.
This is an actual photo of the original.
Yeah.
And there's not many of it, but this is one that I found. And you can see there's Lenin, and then this is the new one that he did that looks very similar.
So Diego and Frida Kahlo planned this the entire time.
Here's the close-up. Now you can see my great-grandfather right there holding a glass with his glasses on. And that was pretty horrible. But anyway, there you go. Oh, dear. So my great-grandfather was pretty angry, so that was the end of that adventure for Nelson.
Diego went home.
Yeah, exactly, right.
But your grandfather also had, besides collecting at that time contemporary art, modern art, he also had a great passion for primitive particularly oceanic art.
That's right. So he started the Museum of Primitive Art, which now is housed in the Metropolitan. And he then gave a wing to the Metropolitan named after his son, Michael. And this collection, as well as many others, went into that wing. And he had to fight with them for a long time. And that was a real challenge because they did not want to take this collection. They felt it was not art, that it was not of the caliber of the art that they were willing to represent.
They wanted to be the Museum of Natural History.
Right.
As ethnography,
right. And
not art.
And that's right. And he said, absolutely not, and I will not do the wing if you do not take this art.
Well, the vice president won.
That's right.
Nelson won.
That's right.
It's
Nelson.
there now.
He didn't know no very well, and that, in this sense, that was a really good thing. So that went into, I think it was in the 70s that went into the collection, or the early 80s, actually.
Just before he died.
That's right. It was just
before
before
like
he died.
78.
That's right.
He died
It was
in
78.
Because I remember going to the
He
opening.
died in 79.
I was
That's
very
right.
young, of course.
Yeah. So, as you know, he was the president 2 times at MoMA, and then his father died in 1960, John D. Jr. And so when his father died, he had been living in Kaikit, and of course they also had apartments in the city, but they all were out here a lot. And so my grandfather wanted to move in. So there's some interesting stories about that, because there were other siblings that also wanted to move in, but Nelson kind of just did. And
your beloved great uncle said, one day my brother just decided to move boxes into Kaikut. So evidently he won.
Yeah, I love that. And David, of course, was the youngest, and Nelson was one of the older brothers. And so David was just like an annoying little bug or something. He didn't pay much attention.
Is this one of your photographs, Mary Louise?
Yes, so this is another one from the helicopter. Yes, it is. And this one I had to lean out. I was trying to get them to fly around the whole top. And what I didn't realize, when you're in a helicopter and you say, oh yeah, can we just go around that thing? a helicopter doesn't really do that. So they go in this tiny little circle, and I'm so busy photographing, I wasn't really paying attention. I had people on the ground saying, we couldn't understand how you could stand that because you went in this little tiny circle around and around and around. But I was so busy photographing that I really didn't realize it.
Speaking of helicopters,
yes.
one of the greatest thing her grandfather did, his brother Lawrence said, "You're like a shepherd. You're always moving Art around." No, he said, Nelson said,
right.
I am finding the place where it belongs to be forever. And one of my favorite stories, David said he was, at that time, head of Chase Manhattan Bank.
Oh,
and
yes.
He was entertaining very important.
Wait, we got to get to that. We'll get to that. Just hang on. So of course, he moves in, right? And then he has all this modern art and all this amazing art that's very different from what his father and his grandfather had.
And he hires Philip Johnson to help him do a museum.
In the gallery, which we'll show. And so you can see there's one of the first pieces he put. It's an artist that is actually still alive, and of course I'm forgetting his name. But here you have this very classical sort of Italian garden, and then you have these wonderful modern pieces throughout, and these are all photos that I've taken. Now, this is a Lieberman.
20 feet high.
Yeah. You don't realize how large that is.
Alex Lieberman is 20 feet high. That shows you the scale of the trees.
Right. So this piece, when he first placed it, he had it right in the golf course, and one of his brothers wrote him a letter and said, I can't understand why you would put this giant thing in the golf course. I'm sure he said it much more eloquently than that, and he asked him, could you please find another place for it? So he then put it in these trees, which actually turned out to be an exquisite place because it really, in scale, it looks just amazing. And then here is a wonderful mayol. And again, you can see the placement is meticulous. And sometimes, as Tom was saying, he would place something, look at it for a while, and then realize, no, this is not the right spot, and then he would move it to another place. And this is Max Bill, again, placing this with this beautiful pergola that's very traditional, and then having this very modern piece at the end of it, similar to that other piece that you saw in the Italian garden. And here's the Max Bill again. And this shows you Marini on the left with the horse. And then, of course, Aristide Mayol again here with Night.
Isn't there another one like that at the Louvre?
At the Louvre, right in the courtyard, yes. Or it was there, I think it's still there. But the placement of those three pieces is astounding, and to make that work, and the gardens are very terraced, so you have all these layers and terraces, and so you find all these surprises as you're walking around. Now, you can tell your story. So here's the Henry Moore. And
you know how much it weighs? Like 3 tons.
Yeah, it's huge.
And
I think it's about 15 feet high, or
15 feet high,
something like that. Yeah,
huge.
it's high. It's big.
And Nelson one Saturday decided to move it, and he had an Army troop helicopter move it. 2 o'clock Saturday afternoon. Guess who's playing golf with important Japanese people? The chairman of the board of Chase Manhattan.
These are all bankers. These were all these Japanese bankers, and this was a very important, alliance that he was probably attempting to have. They're at the tee. They have all their little golf balls set up. Everyone wore hats back then. So here comes
the noise alone. Helicopter. David said you couldn't even hear yourself think. Yeah. And his brother claims he didn't know anyone was there.
Well, so it's really funny because so when I showed these photos to my Uncle David, years back when my mother and I were doing this book, we were trying to get stories from the family to go with the photos. And he told that story, and he said, I know he did it on purpose. And, he said there was golf balls flying everywhere, everyone's hats went off, there was just so much wind that it was like, forget it. Anyway, I was like, oh, that's terrible. And so then I'm going through the archives, and what do? I find this story that my grandfather Nelson had written it down himself and said, my brother always thought I did it on purpose, but I didn't. I didn't know he was going to be there, and I wasn't sure where I was going to put it, and that was one of the spots that I was going to put it, so I thought I'm just going to, bring it, I'll have them come that day. Anyway, okay, well, we're almost done, so. Anyway, it's just too funny. So here it is again, you get a better idea.
And you played in this. It's big enough space to walk.
You can walk right through it. So we used to pretend we were going into Narnia. If any of you have read C.S. Lewis's wonderful stories, we would pretend that we were in, a magic land. Yeah, it was really fun. Here's a wonderful calder. This piece was a stay-bile.
It was a stay-bile about 26 inches high.
28 inches, I think, 28 inches high.
And Nelson had it in his office.
And he said, Calder, I would love it if you could make this exact thing larger. So Calder just made it 28 feet high, which I thought was a riot. he just went right from one, Anyway, it's a beautiful piece, and again, absolutely gorgeous placement. And he was very influenced by, obviously, his mother was one of his biggest influences, but also Alfred Barr, who was at MoMA for many, many years and helped him to curate the collection.
So this is Nelson's private bathroom.
Right.
You can't see it, but look.
So this is in Kaiket. Yeah. This is the master bathroom. Well, originally, right, exactly. It is important, you're right, because it was seniors. No, that's all right. She used to do the lectures with me, and she knows more than I do. So, but anyway, yeah, so...
Isn't there a Degas in the bathroom?
There's a Degas, there's a Bonnard, exactly.
And very good.
And a Cezanne. And now, isn't that a wonderful thing to have a bathroom with those in there next to your... While
you're taking
me take
a bath.
Bath. Absolutely. And Nelson's influences were huge, as we know. And so here's a Leger that he acquired and then gave to the Museum of Modern Art. He also acquired this wonderful piece from Matisse and then gave it to the Museum of Modern Art. And he also acquired this amazing painting from Rousseau, and he also gave that to the Museum of Modern Art. And a lot of these he kept for a while, had them somewhere in his house or whatever, and then he would then give them to the museum. And Alfred Barr and also Dorothy Miller, they were both great at finding some of these for him or with him, and then encouraging him to, now you're going to give this to the museum, of course. And so eventually he would. And just to finish off, he also, when he became governor of New York, moved into the executive mansion, and he had his whole family and all his staff come, and in one weekend completely transformed the entire executive mansion. They didn't know what hit them. And, it was all very traditional and lovely, and then he took everything out and put all these modern pieces everywhere, and there was all this sort of hoopla, and my mother was one of the ones that he had running around with hammer and nail trying to hang things up, and no, put it here, whatever. I mean, you could probably talk to that, but I love that story. And this really changed people's appreciation of this type of art, and he was the first to start the Council of the Arts. So the first
state in the United States.
The first state was New York State, and he was the one that passed that legislature so that we could have Council of the Arts.
And we were the first city, New York City, and he hired his friend Kitty Carlisle.
That's right.
And she ran that.
Absolutely.
We owe so much to Nelson because I don't think his gifts have been, no one has equaled the gifts that Nelson has given to the Museum of Modern Art.
Well, and really he was at that, between his mother and himself, they were at this turning point. You have the turn of the century from the 1800s to the 1900s, and she really, at that time, really was a huge influence on people understanding and appreciating a whole new type of way of seeing art and of just expressing yourself. And so he took that even further, and then because he was so prominent in his, and bigger than life, people followed his example. And all through his life, when he bought from an artist, that artist, it was sort of overnight that artist was established. It was pretty amazing. And we are closing at the end.
This is what, in the basement that Philip Johnson did, a private museum for Nelson, which still exists. And Kaikut is open.
That's right, it's open.
How many months a year now?
It's from May, I think, to October. And it is open 6 days a week, I think. I think it's 6 days a week. And this is the basement. They show you this. And these are these amazing tapestries of Picasso that he had Picasso make with this wonderful weaver, and they're some of them are double the size of the actual paintings, but they translate so beautifully, and they're all in the basement there, or a lot of them are. There was a large collection he had done. And here is Lachaize.
He really saved Lachaize's life. Lachaize had terrible physical problems, and your grandfather not only paid for all of his doctor bills.
He kept asking him to do these pieces for him. Unfortunately, Lachaize was quite ill, and he passed away during the process of this. But my grandfather then had these bronzes made, and this is one of them. And this is his wife. He had his wife model this with another man while he made this piece, and that became a big deal because everyone was like, "Oh my God!"
They were very modern.
Yeah, that's right. They were that's right, very modern, literally. So that's a wonderful piece, and that again is just right. You come upon it as you're walking around, and it's just so beautiful. I know, we're very close. Here's another Mayol, again showing you these wonderful placements. And
I love this. Yeah.
So we're at the very end, and I wanted to read 2 quotes from my grandfather. One is this one talking about his understanding of, or how he understood art, or how he felt about it. The really interesting thing about art is art, not what you say about it. So I have a strange thing about the collecting of art and the creating of art are really motivated by the same inner forces in individuals. There just happen to be 2 groups of people. One that have the capacity to create and to transform those feelings into various forms of artistic creation, and then others, like myself, who can't. And the only thing we can do is collect the works of others. But we are motivated by the same forces, and those forces are the most important and enriching forces, I think, that one can have in one's life. And that, of course, is the Mayol Night again, and here it is again. It's just an amazing piece, and I can't stop photographing it because it's such a wonderful spot. And then this is one last quote from my grandfather. If one helps to create an atmosphere of beauty, serenity, and peace, it nourishes the spirit and fosters dignity and love in those embraced by it. Thank you very much.
And Mary Louise is an embodiment of a collector and an artist, and she has an exhibition at the Galerie Merlot at 16 East 79th Street. And it's on now, but right next to Aquabella between 5th and Madison. So thank you very much. Yeah. And if anyone wants to sign book.
And a lot of these photographs you saw are in the show, and they're also in the book. So, and I don't know if we should be taking questions.
Anyone have a question? Eric Morlot will tell you.
Yeah, it's right on 79th Street between Madison and 5th, and it's number 16. Yeah. East
16
79th.
East 79th, downtown.
And there's some invitations of that show right there, so you're welcome to take one.
Does anyone have a question for Mary? Yes, sir.
Your grandfather's brothers, were they equally as interested in the arts?
I would say
David,
some of them. David especially, his youngest brother David.
20 volumes of the art that he collected. 20 volumes, as thick as an old-fashioned phone book. Yeah. The greatest collection of Asian art was his eldest brother,
right. John D. III. Yeah.
Winthrop Rockefeller has the most unbelievable collection of cars, and also 19th century European. Many are in Arkansas, where he was the governor.
Right.
there's not one Rockefeller that hasn't made a significant contribution to the collecting of art. Particularly, they've been so generous to everyone here in New York. So the answer is yes. And it continues.
We had a little discussion at our table about where the Rockefellers originally came from.
French Huguenots.
Well, they come from Germany, Field of Rocks, Rockenfeld, and there is a story that before that, and the village doesn't exist anymore, but the graveyard is still there. That there were the Huguenots fled from France in like the 12th century or something. There is one story of that they then came to Germany. But there's no proof on that one. But they certainly did come from Germany, and they came to the States, to America in the 1600s, and were in Pennsylvania, and then worked their way up to upstate New York. And that's where John D. Sr. grew up, was in upstate New York. And there actually you can go up to where the house stood, and it was a tiny little house. And they just have a hole where the cellar was with a little sign that says John D. Rockefeller. It's pretty funny.
Any other? Oh, yeah. Oh, Alexander.
Where were the hiding places? You can tell us.
Oh, well, we used to, so that art gallery is in the basement of the main house, and it's a tunnel that was built by his grandfather that went from the house out into the gardens. And then my grandfather turned it into a gallery, and of course it was a wonderful place to run around at night. So we would sneak in there, and we would shut all the lights off, and because there's no windows, it's absolutely, you can't even see your hand. So then we would try and get through the maze of art, which was really crazy. Luckily we didn't break anything, but we were hiding all over the place. Sorry, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, since we are having a delicious lunch, thank you, Marie-Monique. I understand that a few years ago, a wonderful restaurant opened at Pocantico Hill called Blue Hill, based on organic food with crops built on the properties. Can you tell us about it, please?
Sure, I can tell you a little bit. It was the farm barns. We called it the farm barns, and it was where all the horses were kept. In the early days, it was where John D. Sr., he always liked to have all fresh everything and have his own food. So he had his own cows and horses and so on. And so it was where they housed the cows, the dairy cows and the work horses. And then when I grew up, that was where we kept our horses and would ride from there. And so when my grandfather passed away, he had owned that building. My great uncle David took over that building, and he kept it running for a little while, but then he decided, I'm going to tear this down. It's just gigantic. I mean, it's really amazing. Oh, well, and there's also cows.
The pig that had the most piglets in the history of New York.
Oh, no, really kidding. Oh, I did not know that.
And you could go see her.
That's great. Oh, you mean recently?
We ate with the bacon, yeah.
You ate her? You ate the poor?
And her food's now in the restaurant.
So, but in any case, he ended up not tearing down because it was too expensive. It was cheaper to just get all the asbestos and restore it and turn it into this wonderful restaurant and an organic farm. His daughter, so it's Blue Hill is the restaurant, and the farm barns are just called the Stone Barns now. And they have children come from all over, to teach them organic farming. They grow everything. They raise all the animals there. Everything you eat at Blue Hill is from that farm.
And they have a restaurant near Washington Square in New York also.
Yeah, it's wonderful.